I'm Jerry Wasserman. I want to welcome everyone to our live online socially distanced UBC Scholar Series. I am delighted to be speaking today with Dr. Michael Klein, Emeritus Professor of Family Practice at UBC, Adjunct Professor of Family Medicine at McGill, and Senior Scientist Emeritus at the Child and Family Research Institute in Vancouver. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that this event is taking place on the unceded ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and we're grateful to live and work here. The Senior Scholar Series is an initiative of the UBC Emeritus College, and it's been run in conjunction with Green College since 2011. We'll have one more presentation this term on Thursday, March 18th at 5 o'clock. I'll be talking with Carl Walters of the Department of Zoology and Institute for Oceans and Fisheries. You can find out all the details on the Green College or the Emeritus College websites. Excuse me. If you've attended any of our previous sessions, you'll know how it works. Michael and I will have a 45 to 50-minute conversation followed by a Q&A. Please type your question or comment on chat at the bottom of your screen at any time during the hour, and I'll relay it to Michael during the Q&A. Or if you have your video on, you can raise your hand during the Q&A and we'll unmute your microphone so you can actually ask a question out loud. But if your video isn't on, we can't see you, so we can't call on you. So you'll have to use chat. At 6 o'clock or so, Michael has agreed to hang around for a few more minutes and answer further questions. We call the 6 o'clock plus segment our happy hour. And we invite you either to leave if you feel like doing that, if you're too hungry to stay, or if you'd like to stay, pour yourself a glass of wine or not, and stick around and chat for a few more minutes. Now to the reason why we're here. Michael C. Klein has many initials after his name: MD, CCM, CCFP, FCFP, FAAP, FCPS. I hope he'll explain what some of them mean. As a researcher, Michael is best known for his landmark study of episiotomy, which we'll talk about shortly. He teaches at UBC in family practice and midwifery. He's a longtime member of the editorial board of the journal Birth and a past board member of Canadian Doctors for Medicare. Michael was head of the Department of Family Medicine at McGill's Jewish General Hospital in Montreal for 17 years, and head of the Department of Family Practice at Children's and Women's Hospitals in Vancouver for 10 years. Michael's a recipient of the Order of Canada, the Award for Lifetime Contributions to Primary Care Research from the North American Primary Care Research Group, Family Medicine Researcher of the Year Award from the College of Family Physicians of Canada, the Founders Award from DONA International, which is the Doula Training and Certification Organization, another subject for our discussion, the Annual Research Award from LeMays International, and the Lifetime Achievement Award in Family Medicine Research from the College of Family Physicians of Canada. Michael emigrated from the US to Canada in 1967, a story I will have him tell. His family is as distinguished as he is. His children are activists and authors Naomi Klein and Seth Klein. His wife is Bonnie Cher Klein, an award-winning filmmaker, writer, and disability rights activist. Michael's memoir, titled Dissident Doctor, My Life Catching Babies and Challenging the Medical Status Quo, was published by Douglas and McIntyre in 2018. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me to this.
I've just finished reading your amazing memoir, all 288 action-packed pages. For me, the key sentence is near the end where you write, quote, "It's hard to watch the way that birth has been transformed into a technological experience without trying to do something about it," unquote. What you've tried to do about it has been absolutely epic, but before we get to those details, let's begin shortly after your own birth. Tell us a little bit about growing up as a red diaper baby.
Well, It was a time during the 50s in the United States when McCarthyism was at its peak. My father had been an organizer of the Screen Cartoonists Guild in Disney. At Disney, he was an animator working on the classical ones, Bambi, Pinocchio, Fantasia. Those were the days when it was 24 frames a second drawn by hand, no computer stuff. And as a result of his union activities and his left-wing activities, when he was working during the 50s, the McCarthy period, he eventually became unemployable. And it got worse than that. In fact, we were quite afraid about the knock on the door. We were afraid that, or I was afraid that my parents could be taken away. And so I led a kind of dual life, double life. It was the life of the children of left-wing activists of that era. And I had a circle of friends of similar background. And then, of course, I had my normal friends in my high school and before. And because of the time, you didn't share with one group of friends the activities of the others. So it was a tense time, and it was a time when you had to be very careful. And when I think about what has happened to that cohort of red diaper babies, for the most part, they haven't done very well, in the sense that I would say they were psychologically traumatized and suffered because of it. And I can see in their activities and their life trajectory the consequences of that experience. I think I came off with some effects of that as well. And I was fortunate because I had very supportive family and extended friends, and I got through it more or less. I could spend lots of time on that, but I think I could eat the whole hour up.
So you're the challenging the status quo, the subtitle of your book, kind of comes naturally to you from your family background?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure whether it does, actually. I think that challenging the status quo, I believe, simply arises out of the need to question conventional wisdom, and whether that's an effect of my growing up or not, I'm not quite sure. It certainly it isn't an effect of the other red diaper babies, for sure.
Yeah.
The other red diaper babies are more likely to hide than to be challenging the status quo. Sadly.
Yeah. Let's jump ahead to medical school, because your medical school and after the time you spent in Ethiopia and in the South Bronx, very formative years for you, very formative experiences. So you went to college at Oberlin, you went to medical school at Stanford, and tell us about that experience.
At Oberlin or at Stanford?
Stanford.
I think Stanford was a very good medical school for me. The kind of classical medical student was somebody who was heading for an MD PhD, and Stanford was producing a physician scientist. I didn't quite fit because I majored at Oberlin in political science, and I was totally unprepared for medical school. I was mathematically challenged, but I had very generous classmates at Stanford, and a number of them had PhDs already, and they were generous with their time and helped me to get through it. They tutored me in some respects. The first 2 years, the clinical years, were very hard for me, but once I got into the clinical years, from the preclinical years, that it was no longer a problem. there was a wonderful dean at Stanford, Robert Alway, who was instrumental in me getting in. But after I'd spent time in pediatrics, which was where I thought I was heading, I got an international child health fellowship in Ethiopia, where I was supposed to spend 6 months. But as the end of the 6 months came along, I wanted to stay. So I asked the dean whether I could stay for another year and then graduate with the following class. And he said, sure, go ahead. And so that's what happened. And so I spent 1.5 years in Ethiopia. And in that role, I was the only medical student in the children's hospital in Addis Ababa. And believe it or not, they gave me a license to practice medicine, and I was treated just like one of the other doctors, though I wasn't a doctor. And the doctors there gave me enormous freedom and supported me when I needed support. But they basically, I took duty like everybody else, and slept in the hospital alone with 50 kids and 1 nurse. And it was a life-changing experience that I think altered everything about what was to come later, including the midwifery connection, which you may want to hear about more. So I actually was primarily involved with pediatrics, but I also had a midwifery experience. I did not have a family practice experience for a couple of reasons. One is that the discipline that we call academic family practice today hadn't been invented on either side of the border until the early 70s. And of course, at Stanford, in such a high academic environment, I never saw a family doctor all the time I was in medical school. So we have a joke in family practice education that there are 3 principles of family practice education. The first is role models. The second is role models. And the third is role models. There are no other principles. If you can't see one and pattern yourself after such a person, you, of course, can't be one. And I patterned myself after a pediatrician, Robert Greenberg, who was a pediatric endocrinologist and with whom I marched in anti-Vietnam marches during that era. And the pediatricians were the good guys, and so I decided to be one of those.
Talk a little bit about the midwifery experience in Ethiopia. How was that formative, and how is it different from what you were learning in medical school?
Well, first of all, my primary responsibility was on the pediatric hospital. But once, so to speak, the kids were put to bed, and if things were quiet, I would wander through a tunnel between the pediatric hospital and a general hospital. And in the general hospital, midwives were attending births. And they were very generous, and they decided to let me watch, and then they decided to let me catch some babies. And so by the time I returned eventually to Stanford, I had attended about 200 births with the midwives. And I learned about birth from them. The craziness is that when one of the very few things I had to do when I got back to medical school in order to graduate was obstetrics and gynecology. So here I had delivered about 200 babies, attended those births with midwives, and now I had to take obstetrics and gynecology. So I remember my first day of the rotation, the clinical rotation in obstetrics and gynecology. I felt a heavy hand on my shoulder, and it was the chief of obstetrics and gynecology, the academic head of Stanford University department. And he said, Mr. Klein, come into my office. And so I followed him, not knowing exactly what my crime was. And he sat me down and he said 2 very important things. He said, first of all, on my service, every woman will have an episiotomy. And then he said, and this is maybe a sick joke, he said, maybe it wasn't a joke, I don't know. He said, and if she doesn't get one before the birth, she'll get one after, which of course is absurd. And and then he said, if you want to practice primitive medicine, you'll have to go to the county hospital. And he actually exiled me to the county hospital. And when I arrived there, I reported to the chief resident, because then as now, in the county hospital, which was hospital for poor people, indigent people for the most part. In that situation, the chief resident kind of ran the show, and he said, well, what do you want to do while you're here? And I said, well, catch babies, anything else? And I said, don't know why I said it. I said, how about I look after them after I deliver them? Which of course was unknown because everything was siloed. And so he said, well, better talk to the head of pediatrics. So I did, and it was a lovely man, Gordon Williams, and I presented my proposal, and he said, that sounds like a great idea, why don't you do that? So in fact, I had a wonderful experience. You could say it was a precursor for what was to become family practice, but I had no name for it. I just did it. And that was kind of my introduction to family practice, perhaps.
And then you went and interned in New York.
Yeah, I went to Albert Einstein Hospital for my internship in pediatrics. And as part of that internship, I went to Lincoln Hospital, which is in the Southeast Bronx, which, by the way, is where OEC is from. Okay, Ocasio-Cortez, the very well-spoken and wonderful representative. It's a war zone, and it was then and it is now. And believe it or not, the kind of patients I was caring for there it was like Ethiopia. I mean, it was tuberculosis, and it was all sorts of other diseases that are not normally found in most middle-class communities. And but I was well prepared for it. So once again, the Ethiopian experience came back to be very, very helpful. And I was, as an intern, teaching about diseases that most of my colleagues had never seen.
So that obviously the Ethiopian experience, the county hospital experience, the South Bronx experience were at least as important as medical school itself in preparing you for what was to come.
Yeah, that's so. I'll give you one example, which was quite interesting. So one of the diseases of the Southeast Bronx is lead poisoning. In this case, the kids are eating lead paint from windowsills, and they're chewing on them, and there's paint flecks all over the place in these old tenement houses. So I learned how to treat lead poisoning. Later on, when I was a pediatric resident at the Montreal Children's Hospital, I discovered a case of lead poisoning, and I recognized it. While others not exposed to lead poisoning in Montreal, where it was thought not to exist, I was able to recognize it and treat it, and in fact write about it. It was lead poisoning in this case from earthenware pots, and that's a long story which you may not have time for. But to make a long story short, I wound up writing an article for the New England Journal of Medicine while I was a resident, and I can tell you that all my submissions to the New England Journal ever since have failed. but that one was accepted and used, because as a result of the research, we actually changed the pottery and handicraft lead and glaze handbucks and imports on both sides of the border, and we're able to eliminate that source of lead poisoning coming into Canada and the United States.
So tell us how and why you ended up in Montreal, please.
Well, while I was a house officer at Albert Einstein, I was drafted. All doctors were drafted.
This is 1966?
1966, right. And so in 1966, I was, like many of my classmates and cohorts, were trying to keep out of the Army. I wanted nothing to do with Vietnam. And so I applied to the US Public Health Service, which was going to be an alternative. I also applied as a conscientious objector. And again, I'm truncating this. but what happened is that I got a commission in the US Public Health Service, which would have kept me out of the Army. And I was, this is very interesting in the light of recent history. I was assigned to the CDC, the Epidemic Intelligence Service, where I would have learned epidemiology and all of the things we all are so much aware of these days. But a routine question went to my draft board, from my draft board to the US Public Health Service, and they simply asked a simple question: what's his status? And the draft board incorrectly wrote back, he is a conscientious objector. But they didn't grant me conscientious objector status. But you can't be a conscientious objector and be in the US Public Health Service, because in time of national emergency, you could be assigned to any branch of the armed services. So they pulled my commission, and I was immediately drafted as a medical officer. And so what happened is that, having decided I could not in any way participate in the war, and I'll explain to you why, because it's important. There is a document in the US military called the Code of Military Conduct. It has a more elaborate name, but every member of the US Armed Services, from the foot soldier to the general, is governed by this document. And there's a section on the role of the medical officer. And it says that your primary responsibility is to support the mission. And that means that you're to return the soldier to combat as soon as possible, which to me meant that you were no different from the soldier who was there to kill, and you were supporting a killing exercise that was immoral and stupid. And so I wanted no part of that. So Bonnie and I made plans to come to Canada. And in fact, technically speaking, I'm a deserter, because I was actually commissioned as an officer in the US military, medical corps. But between being commissioned and getting my actual assignment, we fled to Canada and arrived in the middle of the night in Montreal, where we were told was the best place to go. And we were told to come in after midnight, very specifically after midnight, which you'll find interesting, because the immigration officers on duty after midnight were French Canadians. They had the lousy jobs. During the day, the Anglophone immigration officers were likely to be unsympathetic to draft resistors of any type, let alone deserters. And so we followed the instructions and came in after midnight, met a very friendly officer in 1967 who effusively welcomed us to Canada. And I had landed immigrant status in 20 minutes. Imagine that. And I had an x-ray, Bonnie had an x-ray, and this is before the point system, and we arrived, and I started working immediately at the Children's Hospital in Montreal, and they were wonderful. The staff of the Children's Hospital welcomed me and used me I was immediately made a senior resident based on my experience, and the rest is history. And that was Bonnie sneezing.
Family practice. So you said that you couldn't be a family practitioner without a role model, but the family practice per se didn't actually yet exist. So can you give us a kind of condensed version of how you, over the years, organized family practice in your own medical environments and elsewhere?
Well, what happened is that I finished my training at the Montreal Children's Hospital, and I had gone through the whole training. I was chief resident there, and there was no, I was done. And what I wanted to study, which at the time was community medicine, also didn't exist in Canada. And so reluctantly, we didn't really want to leave Canada. Bonnie had a great job at the National Film Board of Canada, but she was supportive, and we moved to Rochester, New York, where I took a fellowship in community medicine, community pediatrics. But as part of that fellowship, it was under Dr. Robert Haggerty, who was a wonderful man. I had a project which I developed, which was to develop a network of 3 neighborhood health centers in Rochester, New York. And I met family practice for the first time in Rochester. It was an early program, and I was tremendously impressed with the appropriateness of family practice as a primary care discipline.
Can you just define briefly what family practice is, how it's different from general practice, say?
Well, general practice in those days was a 1-year rotating internship, and then you went out into practice. You were not prepared for where you were going. A rotating internship, you simply rotated from each of the specialties: surgery, pediatrics, medicine, and so on. But you didn't get any training at all in what you were going to see in office practice. So academic family practice began in the United States as a 3-year program in which you specifically trained for what you were going to be practicing. And it was a discipline that had its own ethos, it had its own politics, it had its own language, very symptom-based language, because many diseases that you see in family practice are in early stages where they come in as symptoms, not as diagnoses. And so that was rapidly evolving. And I decided that in the 3 health centers that I had developed, that I would use only a family practice model. And we would use specialists as specialists are meant to be used as consultants when things got beyond what you would see in office practice. And so I envisioned myself as being their pediatric consultant. And I had a rather schizoid life because I was also running the newborn intensive care unit for 3 months of the year at the University of Rochester at Strong Memorial Hospital, at the request of Robert Haggerty, that's what he needed. And so I hadn't yet transitioned into family practice myself. So I was a pediatrician consultant in the centers that I had developed, but ran the newborn intensive care units. So I soon realized that, in fact, the well-trained family doctors didn't need me as a pediatric consultant. They used me, but if I wasn't there, they could have gotten a pediatric consultation from a number of other people. And I really liked what they were doing, and I made the decision that I'd see if I could be one. But I was in a unique position because everyone around me was a family doctor. So I just simply started seeing adults. And when I had a problem that I couldn't figure out, I just knocked on the door of whoever was practicing next door, and I had instant consultation. And when I had a need for a hospitalization of an adult patient, I figured I'd really go to the top. So I would co-manage with the head of internal medicine or the head of surgery or the head of obstetrics and gynecology. And over 5 years, I had a personal tutorial, you could say. And then I took the boards in family practice and became a family doctor. I didn't stop becoming a pediatrician. I simply added family practice.
I know in the second half of your book, you talk a lot about the team concept and how much better that is than the kind of individual, a series of specialists and a doctor who consults with them. Was Rochester where you first got a sense of the kind of potency of that team concept?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, that's where it began. And, it just kept growing. So after 5 years in Rochester, I was recruited back to Montreal to be head of the family practice program at the Jewish General Hospital, which was the first McGill family practice training program. So I was head of the overall department, but I also was head of the family practice teaching center. And I did that for, as you say, 17 years, or maybe 18 years. And what happened there is that I was working with nurse practitioners, and we had specialists available as well in teams, as you say, and we cared for multi-problem families. And at the time that I took over, there were no births by family doctors in the hospital, and there hadn't been for 15 years. So I started delivering babies. And then I hired a couple of family doctors who delivered babies. And by the time I left for UBC, I was recruited to UBC by Carol Herbert, who is on the call. And she brought me to Women's and Children's Hospital. And by the time I had left that little obstetrical experiment in Montreal, we were delivering 1,000 babies a year of the 3,500 babies in this was the university hospital. So, but we did it differently. We did it with nurse practitioners, and we did it with educators, and we did it in collaboration with the obstetricians as needed. And that's team practice. And when we come to Montreal, we came to BC, I did the same thing.
So, okay, to a non-medical specialist and someone who's never had a child except as a father, why wouldn't family practitioners have been delivering babies? Were babies only delivered by obstetricians?
Well, it really depends widely in Canada by location. So, for example, in Montreal, there was one obstetrician for every 7 family doctors. In British Columbia, there's one family practitioner for every 30 family obstetricians.
You mean one obstetrician for every 30?
Exactly, one obstetrician for every 30 family physicians. So as soon as you know that, you know everything.
Right.
So that what happens in British Columbia is family practitioners do most of the obstetrics, this is changing, did in 1991 when I came out. And while back in Montreal, we were very unusual because family doctors really didn't do that in Montreal. The most specialist dominated city in the country. And the last medical school, McGill was the last medical school to have an academic department of family practice in Canada. Mm. British Columbia was way ahead. And British Columbia had, the family doctor was the center of the operation then and still is. And in Toronto and Montreal, it's still, these are still specialist dominated cities, though family practices are making important inroads.
Do you account for that culturally, or?
Well, yes, culturally, big city kind of specialist stuff is kind of universal. You see that across the world. Yeah, okay. We're at the frontier, and we have lots of rural. British Columbia is a very rural province, and you don't have specialists in the hinterland. You have no choice. The family doctor is the backbone of the entire system. And I mean, for example, if you take this pediatric example, with rare exceptions, all the pediatricians are located in Vancouver or Victoria, and in Vancouver, concentrated at the Children's Hospital. Mm-hmm. So the family doctors have to be extremely well trained, and they have to practice full scope of practice. While in the larger cities, family practice doesn't have to be, but can be a kind of revolving door between the patient and the specialist. And that's not the way that we want to train family doctors, and fortunately, that's not what they do. Here on the Sunshine Coast, where I am, there are, there's 2 obstetricians and, 40 family doctors and so on, and one ophthalmologist and 2 internists. And family doctors run the show, and the consultants are there to support the family doctors, and there is no conflict.
So one of the things for which you are best known is your anti-episiotomy campaign. And in the book as well, you talk a lot about the C-section and how often that is used in birthing unnecessarily. And your promotion of midwifery and of doulas, those all seem to me to be complementary to one another. And at the heart of it, partly at the heart of that, I guess, is the quotation that or the line that I quoted earlier about the transformation of birth into a technological experience, and the way that the medical specialists tend to want to cut, for instance, whereas your philosophy is quite a bit different. Can you kind of pick that apart for me and explain how?
Well, the episiotomy trial that you're referring to, it stems directly from my experience in Ethiopia and later in the county hospital. My crime in Stanford was delivering without episiotomy the way the midwives had taught me. And it just made no sense to me. And so there had been randomized controlled trials of episiotomy in the world, but none by doctors. They were all midwifery trials. And that meant that obstetricians could dismiss those trials as irrelevant for them. Right. There had never been a trial in North America. So I did a randomized controlled trial involving more than 1,000 women in 3 hospitals in Montreal. And the results of the trial are very simple. They show that episiotomy done routinely causes the very trauma it's supposed to prevent. And we could spend a lot of time on the trial, but that's the essence of what the trial shows. The episiotomy rates in Canada were about 65% at the time that the trial was undertaken. It rapidly dropped. So the episiotomy rate now, as a result of the trial and midwifery's influence and the influence of lots of other people who were ready to, anyhow, my trial was timely, but because lots of people thought that episiotomy done routinely was stupid, but it was what was done conventionally. So the episiotomy rates went down to between 9 and 12%. And the severe trauma rate, which means trauma to and through the rectum, occurred at 4.5% of all births. And as a result of the drop in episiotomy, it has gone to 1% or less. So that's huge, because that kind of trauma, severe trauma to the perineum and the rectum, is a catastrophe and can lead to long-term problems, including pelvic floor problems. And I was very concerned about the pelvic floor issue. So as part of my trial, I actually measured pelvic floor functioning before and after birth, and was able to show through a device that we use called electromyographic perineometry, which is basically Kegelometry, if anybody knows what a Kegel is. It's a squeeze. It's a squeeze that tightens up the pelvic floor. And we can measure that that makes fancy graphs, and they're very impressive. And I was able to demonstrate what the pelvic floor effect was of doing episiotomies. And so that was an important part of the trial that had never been done, and it was quite impressive. And so it was one of the things that led people to reject routine episiotomy and use it only for selective purposes. But the rest of the story, gets very interesting, because I have to tell you that the language that was being used in the 60s and 70s to justify episiotomy is the very same language which is used today to justify routine cesarean section. It's all about preventing urinary incontinence and other things that are not, that are relatively rare and are only marginally improved by cesarean section. And routine cesarean sections, particularly at more than one, are associated with a huge array of problems, including frequency of placental attachment problems of all kinds. And so the problem is that obstetricians, for the most part, are surgeons. And so we shouldn't be surprised if surgeons do surgery. And they're obstetrician gynecologists. And of course, midwives are the experts in avoiding surgery. And their research is only now really reaching the point where it can influence the whole area of maternity care. And midwifery, women who are lucky enough to have a midwife are will avoid a lot of the trauma that occurs in birth. But over the country as a whole, there are not enough of them. And so the midwives, while they have an important influence for their very fortunate patients, the question is, do they influence the larger community of women who are having babies? And I think that they do have an influence, but in order to have that influence, they have to be politically active. It doesn't happen by itself. Unfortunately, their patients are politically active. In British Columbia, we're very fortunate. I mean, more than 20% of births now are attended by midwives, which some people find shocking. It's much, much lower in other provinces. And the reason it's higher here is because we have a higher proportion of midwives. But the number of midwives that are available compared to the women who want midwives is small. And so midwifery at UBC has gone from 8 midwives to 12 midwives to 24 midwives and more. And it has to grow. And it may be of interest that during the COVID epidemic, there are a whole bunch of healthcare providers who are considered essential service. Midwives are not considered by the province as essential, which is crazy. I mean, they're delivering 20% of the babies or more, and they have to be considered essential. Many of them are making their own PPE, their own protective gear at their own expense, and that has to change.
You've also been a great advocate for doulas. Can you just explain? I mean, we know midwives deliver babies. What do doulas do?
Doulas are supportive companions for the women who have engaged them. They do not work for the hospital. They do not work for any institutions. They work for the woman, and they are not conflicted in any way by having to, play a professional role. They're not playing a professional role. They're playing a supportive role. In the early days of midwifery, there was some midwives who were a little confused about the doula role versus their role. I mean, the doulas do not deliver babies. But these days, the strongest supporters of doulas are midwives. Everybody needs a doula, or 2 or 3. I mean, the midwives are supporting, the doulas are supporting the midwives, they're supporting the doctor, they're supporting, of course, primarily the woman. And the research shows clearly that when doulas are involved, the outcomes are better, especially in situations where there is no midwife, because the midwives have a similar philosophy to the doulas, but they have a difficult role to play because they're not responsible for the birth, and they are supporting the women, but they sometimes run afoul of people who consider them to be interfering with the birth. So very sophisticated doulas have developed a way of being present and influencing the environment without interfering with the professional role. There's a lot written about that, and some people do it better than others, but basically the days of having doulas thrown out of the room are mostly gone.
I got one more question for you, and that has to do with the title that you chose for this talk, which is Childbirth for Grandparents, Childbirth as Metaphor. Want to explain what you mean by that?
Well, I think the way society treats pregnant women and newborns is a marker for how society feels about women and the importance of birth, and where we see birth as a natural activity versus a surgical experience matters greatly. And across the world and across North America, there are vast differences in maternal mortality rate. And for example, in British Columbia, the maternal mortality rate is 3 per 100,000. In Alabama, it's 21 per 100,000. And that tells you something about the country and their value system. We're doing pretty well, but we still have problems. I mean, for example, what is quite prominent in the news these days is, for example, racism in medical care. Well, racism in medical care includes racism in maternity care. And there are lots of examples of women who consider that they were not treated respectfully by the people caring for them. And that has to change in the same way it has to change totally. So I think it is a metaphor in the sense that if we treat mothers and babies the way we should as a society, we would have, I think, different results, and about how medicine itself is seen by society, and we would really understand how important it is for young families to be treated in an appropriate way from the beginning of their lives as families.
I actually have one more question for you, because that reminded me of some of the most compelling examples in your book are about your challenge to a diagnosis, or your challenge to the way that a patient was treated or mistreated, including your own father in an extended example. And you go to great lengths to argue for the notion that doctors are fallible and can misdiagnose and can misunderstand this situation, and that you have to be a strong advocate and you have to be willing to intercede. But you're a doctor. You've got leverage and clout and understanding of the situation. How would you recommend that a layperson in a situation like that play a useful role?
Well, I think everybody knows that things go wrong in medical care. Everybody knows that people forget things and make diagnoses that are wrong or are partially wrong, and that these things need to be corrected. Most importantly, the family member knows the patient better than any professional can possibly ever know. And I think that being a doctor is both helpful and harmful, but leaving that aside for the moment, the advocacy role is absolutely critical. And I think that I give many examples in the book where interceding is essential. But how to do that and how to do it effectively and being seen as a member of the team is something that people can't do by themselves. That they need to try, because they need to feel empowered to do that, even if often their intercessions are not welcome. You have to do it anyhow, because if you don't do it, unfortunate things happen. If you do it, I mean, you have to do it in a respectful way.
Yeah.
A lot depends on who's the doctor, of course. In the care of my father, he was in a coronary intensive care unit for a long period of time. And every Friday, a new attending physician came on board. The residents stayed the same. If the attending cardiologist was a humanist, the residents were humanists. If the attending cardiologist was not a humanist, was dismissive of family comments or questions, they were the same. They were like chameleons. The residents stayed the same. And it says a great deal once more about the question of role models.
Yeah.
And so, but your question was about advocacy, and I take your point. Yes, of course, it's easier if you're a physician, but at the same time, whether you're a physician or not, your family member is somebody you have to defend, not in an aggressive way, but in a respectful way. We as physicians, when we get sick, we get both the best and the worst care. We get overtreated and we get undertreated, and that's a whole other story.
Well, I think on that note, thank you so much, Michael Klein. That was fantastic. And I can't advocate too strongly for this book. It's a really terrific read. You're a good writer on top of everything else. And the stories that you tell are very powerful. I cried. One story about an intern delivering his first baby with your hands around his hands. He cried, I cried, you might have cried. It's a really great book.